The other day, I listened to part of a talk by Ayasanta Chita. She's a nun. She, along with Ayananda Bodhi, lived in a small vihara up in Northern California called Aloka Vihara for a number of years. It closed a few months ago, but really wonderful. They're both wonderful teachers. They're Theravada nuns, and Ayasanta Chita had a line in her talk that really grabbed me. And she said, "Reality is showing us the way, and it's up to us to pay attention and clear the mind of distractions." And I'll repeat that. Reality is showing us the way, and it's up to us to pay attention and clear the mind of distractions. I really like that. And as I was thinking about it, it reminded me of a line I heard in a documentary about Amy Winehouse. Some of you may know Amy Winehouse. She was a singer, really great singer, and she died of an overdose a few years ago. She was British. And in the documentary, they were talking to Tony Bennett, who she had done a duet with, and he was saying he had a line that he said, "Life teaches us to let it, or if we live long enough," in return, referring to her, if we let it. And I thought really all about paying attention to reality. It's about paying attention to what's actually happening. And oftentimes we think we're paying attention, but really what we're doing is paying attention to the things that perhaps annoy us, or perhaps the things that get in the way of what we want, the things that are obstacles or challenges, or whatever we decide to call them. Um, we pay attention to how we can get what we want. We pay attention to what we need to control, or things we need to change or shift or whatever. And so the invitation of both of these sentences, these statements, and actually the invitation of the Buddha is to pay attention to reality, pay attention to what is, not what we think it should be. And it I was really in the midst of this over the last week. I was on vacation. I was back east. I grew up in New York, so I went back to New York for a week, and it hadn't been there, of course, it hadn't been there since before the pandemic, and so there was a lot to pay attention to. There were the surroundings, there were my family, there were my friends, and oftentimes when I go back, I have to have this. I have this idea of what I want to do, and then I want to see this person. I want to do this thing. I want to go here. I want to go there. I want to eat this. And then I get there, and then there's the reality of the experience. And so, how do I hold that reality against what I wanted to happen? And for me, it was a real slowing down. That my signal's breaking up, so I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video, so maybe that'll help. So there's a real slowing down for me when I'm in a situation that I had perhaps a little bit of an expectation about, but then the reality is something very, very different. I had this, one of the things I wanted to do when I was back there was visit my father's grave. He died when I was little, and I'd never been to his grave. And I went out to, he's buried in this cemetery, which is one of the most ginormous cemeteries I've ever seen. It's called Calvary Cemetery, and it was established in 1848. And there are a whole hell of a lot of people buried there. I mean, it goes for miles. And I had the coordinates of where he was buried, because I had the receipt and of when my mom had him buried. And I got there, and I got to the space and there was no gravestone. There was no headstone. And it's like, okay, all right. And I remember just pausing and being with what emotions were arising. Was there a disappointment? Was there a sadness? What expectations did I have? And so there's a lot of, when we're really being with reality, there's a lot of investigation, there's a lot of curiosity about what is the experience that's right here. And so because I was simply present and I wasn't caught up in the wah, I want it to be different from the way it is, I happened to notice another headstone that was, then the names seemed familiar on it. And then I realized it was my great grandfather who died in 1869 and his daughter and her married name, which I remembered from some of the ancestry.com stuff I had done. And so because I was paying attention, I had this other experience that was like, wow, I wasn't expecting that. And I imagine my father and my grandfather are all buried in the same grave because a lot of times they just don't bother to carve the next names on the grave. But anyway, for me, it was a visceral experience of, this is the reality. It's not the expectation of what I had hoped for or what I had wanted to happen. So how do I hold it? And that's exactly what's being pointed to. Reality is showing us the way. Oh, be with what's here. Open to this moment. And for me, one of my favorite phrases, and I mentioned it in the meditation instructions, right now it's like this. Can we be with this? Or are we stuck on our shoulds and must-haves and no, this is the way it needs to be? Can we roll with it? Can we surf the wave of reality? I listened to another talk by Aya Ananda Bodhi, who was one of the other nuns at Alokavihara with Ayasanta Chitta. And she said, very much in the same vein, she said, the more we're attuned to the truth of the way things are, the more clear things are, the more okay things are, even in the most difficult situations. Even in the most difficult situations. So, and I find that to be true when we're able to be fully present and we're not holding on to shoulds, we can have much more space around what's actually happening, which might actually be better than what our expectations or our hopes were. And I had another experience this week. A friend of mine who I've known for, gosh, almost 50 years, she went into hospice last month and she was expected to live a few months. She was hoping to get to her birthday in June, but she didn't. She passed away suddenly on Tuesday. It looked like she had a stroke and then some seizures and was unconscious. And she had been at home, but they took her to a hospice facility and she ended up dying in the hospice facility. And her wife was upset because she said she wanted to die at home and that didn't happen. But the reality of the situation pointed to taking her to the facility because it was much more compassionate. They were able to make her really a lot more comfortable. They were able to give her pain meds. They were able to let her leave this world with some ease, whereas if she had died at home, it would have been a real struggle. It would have been probably really painful. And so in this case, reality pointed them in a different way that was much more compassionate than the plan. Because we think, oh man, I want to die at home. That's the way to go. But it's like, maybe it's not. Can we let go of what we think it needs to be and instead let go into the truth of the way things are? Can we let go into the way things are? And it makes so much sense to practice letting go because everything changes. Everything changes. I mean, travel back to when you were a little kid and what you wanted when you were a kid. My wants and desires are a lot different now than when I was a kid. I mean, I wanted to fly like Superman when I was a kid, but that's not happening. I wish. I still would like to, but I'm not holding on to it like I was then. Even 15 years ago, even 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, what I wanted, what I thought would be best, is not necessarily what is best. It's not, if there's the reality of what's happening, and then there's me holding on to, no, it has to be this way. But we have to be willing to just let go. Everything changes. As I said, travel back and think about what it was. Family changes, friends change, everything changes. I went for a hike this morning in Griffith Park, and everything is green and lush, and the wildflowers are blooming. And I was there a couple of weeks ago, and it was different. And I'll be there again in a couple of weeks, and it'll be different again. And it's like, no, I want it to stay the way it is right now. Oh, I do, because it's absolutely gorgeous. But the reality is it's not going to change. So I can fight and kick and scream, or I can say, right now it's like this. Right now it's like this. How do I hold what's present without too much pain? One of the things that attracted me to Aya Santachicha's talk was the title. She said, even civilizations are impermanent. And I'm an archaeologist, and I have dug up cities, or one of the digs I was on was excavating a city that was 5,000 years old that people had forgotten actually existed. So everything shifts and changes. I mean, the United States is not going to last forever either. We are shifting and changing, and who knows how long. I mean, it's just the nature of the beast. But when we fight and we scream and we demand that things remain a certain way, it can cause a lot of harm. In fact, you see that going on today with all the banning of the books and the restrictions on what can be taught in schools and the denial of the reality of history. History is written by the victors. History is written by the people in power. History does not necessarily reflect the truth of what happened. It's not necessarily the facts. You know? It's what we think should be written down. And we see this again and again and again. So the invitation of this practice, and the Buddha said it in his teaching, don't believe it just because people say it. Find out for yourself what leads to away from suffering, what leads to freedom, what leads to awakening, what leads towards suffering. Don't believe it just because you're told. Be present with reality, and reality will show you where to go, what to do. Pay attention and clear the mind of distractions. The distractions are wanting things to be a certain way, our perceptions. And I was talking about this yesterday, and somebody was mentioning they had listened to an old talk by Joseph Goldstein, and he was talking about, even what we see is not necessarily what it is. It's our perception of it based on our conditioning, based on how we interpret things. And he mentioned a rainbow. We think it's like this beautiful thing in the sky, when actually the scientific explanation for it is like droplets of water and light and this and that, much less romantic. But that's what it is. And so to recognize we can enjoy the rainbow, it can be incredibly pleasant. But to not think that it's this bunch of bars up in the sky, and maybe there's some gold at the end of it, but just to acknowledge that. And you know, it's like when you wake up or if you wake up in the morning and it's still dark and you see a shadow on the floor and think it's a rat, and then you turn on your light and it's a sock. You know, we react to our perceptions. And so this practice is inviting us to react instead, or respond to reality. And then the reality will take us in the appropriate direction. Ananda Bodhi said also, she said, we can let go. We can let go of these things because we're not pushed around by our wanting or not wanting. When we are willing to let go of our preferences for how things should be, then there's the freedom. When we're stuck in wanting things, when we're stuck in preferences, it becomes a struggle against reality. And we never win a fight with reality. Reality is the way it is. Whether we jump up and down screaming, I want, this can't be, blah, 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 that's when there's so much discontent, there's so much suffering, there's so much, that's what dukkha is, an inability to be with what is. That's one of the definitions of dukkha. Inability to be with what is. And if we can be with what is, rest in being. Right now it's like this. This is equanimity. This is equanimity. So oftentimes, what happens is when we begin to let go of our ideas about the way things should be, our wants, our dislikes, our little rigid view of the world, when we begin to allow those to dissipate because we see that perhaps we're holding on to an idea that worked when we were 18 but doesn't really serve anymore. Did you ever get stuck in that thing? It's like chasing a dream and then all of a sudden going, wait a minute, do I even want this anymore? Why am I chasing this? It's because it's been on our list, but we never revisit the list. And when we revisit the list, all of a sudden it's like, oh, who am I without this idea? And what we want to do is guide ourselves, have some kind of a foundation that allows us to guide our lives in a way that's wise, in a way that's skillful, in a way that's wholesome. And for me, that's why I find the Buddhist teachings so important and so powerful. The Eightfold Path is the Four Noble Truths, that there is suffering, and the root cause of our suffering is all the time. If we can let go of that, that is the path to freedom, and that fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path is how we live in harmony with the world, which includes wise action, wise speech. It includes wise view, seeing clearly, being connected to reality. It includes intention of letting go of what doesn't serve and moving through the world with gentleness and kindness and compassion. Living in a way that doesn't cause harm, that cultivates compassion and generosity and kindness, that's wise and skillful, that is mindful, that is grounded in equanimity. So that is what we allow to guide us, not our list of things we must, not our bucket list, but how do we show up with kindness? How do we show up skillfully? That's the invitation of these presents. So, that's the invitation of this practice. So the question becomes, what do you listen to? Do you listen to the old stories, the unresolved issues of the past? That's a line from Ayasanta Chitta. I just read a book last week, and apparently it's a show on HBO, or it was My Brilliant Friend, which is really it's a memoir. It's written by one woman, but it's a memoir of her and her friend growing up, and they grew up in Naples in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, which is a very different world. It's a world of very rigid roles. If you were born here, this is your role. If you were a woman, if you were a man, if you were this, if you were that, this, there was class and economic roles, and incredibly rigid. It was strict, it was rigid, it was violent, there was a lot of suffering. If you stepped outside of the role, it was a really harsh reaction to that. And so um, these two girls, and growing into women, it's a story of they're trying to break out of their roles and the obstacles of letting go and really coming into, just, yeah, being true to themselves, living in a way that wasn't tied to this rigidity that was like hundreds of years old, that didn't serve and didn't work out for anyone except for the very few. And so and sometimes, even if we break out of those things, even if I no longer am stuck in the institutions I was growing up, the beliefs I was taught when I was a kid that I no longer believe, there's still some residual stuff there that is like a deep autopilot reaction to things. So to really be willing to examine how we react and what's reality. So where do we get stuck? What old stories are still present in our lives, and can we let go of them? How do you choose to move through the world? There's a um, there's a desire, and desire often has a bad rap in Buddhism, like you have to get rid of all desires. And it's like, well, actually there's are two words in Buddhism that are used, I think, oftentimes, sometimes translated as desire, chanda and tanha. And chanda is desire, but it's wholesome and skillful. It's a desire to be present. It's a desire for awakening. It's a desire to live wholesomely. It's a desire to live as a bodhisattva, to develop a kind heart. So that's wholesome and skillful, versus tanha, which generally means thirst. And that's when desire turns compulsive, turns obsessive. And that's when it causes suffering. And so if you have a wholesome desire that's has a foundation in the teachings, let's say the Eightfold Path, something that's skillful and wise, then that's something you want to cultivate. That's something you want to tend to. And so how do you choose to move through the world? That is what the question of this practice is, and that is what the investigation of our experience is. Are we living a way that is fully present with reality and responding wisely and skillfully, or are we stuck in these ideas of the way things should be? The invitation is to let life teach us how to live it. Let reality show us the way, and be willing to clear the mind of distractions. Let go of the wanting and the not wanting. And so I invite you to spend some time with your own um, experiences. It's always helpful to recognize when suffering is present. We have to recognize when suffering is present, whatever it is for you, however it shows up. Discomfort, when you're uncomfortable. What is that? Not sad, not experiencing grief or sorrow, the eight worldly winds of the human condition, but when you're stuck in something. wanting something when you know it's never going to happen. Can you let go of that? That's where the suffering is. That's what you want to investigate. That's where the freedom lies. This willingness to let go of these deeply embedded stories that don't serve anymore. So that's pretty much what I have to offer this afternoon, and I would love to hear maybe where you're stuck, or if you have any questions or comments or thoughts or rebuttals. I'm all about rebuttals too. Um, so let's just sit for a few moments then and take a couple of breaths to come into your body again. Letting go of the future and the past, and just opening into the experience of sitting, the experience of being, the reality of this moment. Reality shows us the way. So perhaps setting an intention to be present with reality and letting go of distractions as best you can, being connected to each moment as it arises. Greet each moment with wisdom and compassion, walking a path towards freedom, walking a path to awakening. Thank you, everyone. So nice to be with you, and reminding, if you would like to donate time or skills or in a financial way to support ICD, we're always happy to have you be part of our community, the community. So with that, I look forward to seeing you next time, and much love. Be kind to yourself, be kind to each other, and I will see you next time.